This all started with my child. She was the first to see them. I feel bad for her. She was the first one to experience the terror my wife and I would soon feel for ourselves. It began about a week ago, and I don't know what to do. Me, my wife Kimmy, and our 6-year-old daughter Anna live in a modest 4-bedroom house, in a place where we're victim to semi-regular blackouts. Only lasting for a minute or two most of the time, they're more of a minor inconvenience than a true problem. We've been dealing with them for close to 3 years now, and we've learned to live with them. On the plus side, being subject to these somewhat frequent blackouts has afforded us a surprisingly cheap mortgage. But that's neither here nor there. As I said, this began about a week ago. Anna came into our bedroom at about 1:30 in the morning and nudged me awake. I had to look at my phone to see the time because the clock on my nightstand read a steadily blinking 12 o'clock, which meant we must have had another blackout. "What's wrong, sweetie?" I asked, my comforting tone thankfully overpowering the irritation in my voice due to being woken up. "There's a man outside, and he won't stop looking in my window." My heart sank into my stomach and I jumped out of bed, telling my daughter to stay with Mommy. I grabbed the baseball bat I keep next to the bed and ran to her room, looking out both of her windows, and I could see no one. I did a circle around the house in both directions, looking into the distance every which way, and saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just other houses on our block, our backyard as quiet as it could be, and the woods past our fence as peaceful as they ever were. Convinced my daughter had just had a bad dream, I told her I checked and no one was there, and that she could stay in bed with us that night. The following morning, she asked about this quote-unquote man outside her window again. I told her that she had just had a bad dream and to not worry about it. Later that night, I was up late, getting some writing done. It's my profession. When the power once again went out. My laptop switched to battery mode, so I kept working. It was about a minute and a half later when the power came back on, and I heard footsteps coming down our hardwood hallway floor. As I turned around, I saw my daughter stumble into my office with a look of sheer horror in her eyes. She said that the same man and 2 other people had come up to her window and said that, quote, "They were gonna get you and Mommy and save me for last." Through her hysteric tears, her words were hardly intelligible. I once again ran around the house, searching for anything that could confirm my daughter's reason for being so horrified. I found nothing, and again let her sleep in our bed while I eventually dozed off in my office. I was awoken in the morning by my wife, who had been unaware of the events the night prior. I told her I had checked it out and that we had nothing to fear. She wasn't satisfied enough, though, and resolved to sleep in Anna's room with her that night. I was once again working on my project late when the power once again went out. Now, when I say we get semi-regular blackouts, I mean maybe 3 or 4 times a week, maybe. And like I said, only for a minute or 2 at a time each. Rarely did we get 2 in a row, and I don't think we ever had one 3 nights in a row. This one lasted much shorter than the rest. It was only about 15 seconds, and about 3 seconds before the power returned, I heard my wife let out a shrill scream. I sprinted out of my office and into Anna's room as her nightlight and alarm clock came back on, and found my wife and daughter huddled into the corner of the room. I asked what was wrong, and my wife confirmed Anna's stories. This time, 5 people had come up to the window, and had just been smiling and waving, but not in a nice way. She said their smiles were crooked and wide, as if they were straining to smile as big as they could, with their eyes just wide open. My only response to being told this was, "What the fuck?" She said when the lights came back on, she looked away for a moment, and when she looked back, the people were gone. We called the police and made a statement, and they agreed to put a patrol car down the street from our house and have an officer keep an eye on us. This gave us some sense of peace, if only for that night. We rested easy for most of the night, Anna sleeping in the bed with my wife in our room, and I was in the living room watching TV. Until the power went out. I looked out the window and, to my surprise, the rest of the houses on the block were still with power. Porch lights were still on, and the glow of televisions in other houses still illuminated through their windows. It was then that I saw a group of people slowly walking down the street towards our house. They were in the middle of the road, under the still shining streetlights, just casually strolling, and the cop was doing nothing. As I got closer, I noticed that they were walking very loosely, their bodies being held up with the least amount of effort possible, their backs arched backwards a tiny bit with their arms flailing back and forth, as their nimble legs carried them towards my home. And it was when they got even closer that I saw their smiles. My wife hadn't exaggerated. Even from a distance, the streetlights showed me that their neck veins were popping out from straining to smile as wide as they could. I stared out my window at them, trying to figure out what they were doing, when from out of nowhere one of them popped up in front of me, sending me falling back onto the floor. It was a man, looking to be about 30 years old, just standing there, waving at me with that gross smile stretching across his face. I stood up and looked out the window I could see the cop through. Not only was he sitting there doing nothing, but there was another group of 3 of these, whatever they are, flailing past his car. Unless he was sleeping, there was no way he could have missed them. They all converged on the sidewalk adjacent to my front yard and lined up horizontally. And then, as if in a choreographed fashion, from left to right, each one began doing their creepy walk towards my house. I was frozen in fear for a moment, but then I snapped out of it. I had to make sure my family was okay, so I rushed down the hall to my bedroom. To my horror, my wife and daughter were not in the bed where I'd left them earlier. There was, however, 2 of these freaks outside each of our bedroom windows. I screamed at the top of my lungs, "What the fuck did you do with my family?" And just then the lights turned back on, and my wife and daughter came out of our walk-in closet. They both hugged me and cried, while I stood there in shock. I looked out the window and saw no one. I broke away from the hug and rushed back to the living room. There was no one in any direction for as far as the eye could see. I couldn't make any sense of this. I armed myself with my baseball bat and walked over to the police car. There he was, wide awake, sitting and listening to music. I asked what the hell he was doing there if he wasn't going to do anything to help us. I explained that people had walked directly towards him and past him, and that he just sat there doing nothing. He claimed he hadn't seen anyone, and had been awake the whole time. He then told me to get back in my house while he went and did a search of the neighborhood. I saw him drive off down the street, shining his spotlight through each and every yard and side yard on the block. My family and I stayed up together in the living room for the rest of the night. Nothing happened for the next 2 nights, so we thought that whatever was going on had passed. Even so, I went to my father's house the day after the last incident and retrieved the gun I had there, a .45 caliber Glock 37. Normally, my wife didn't allow guns in the house, but with the events of the previous few nights, she made an exception to the rule for as long as we had to deal with this. It was last night that things happened again. The 3 of us had taken to sleeping in the living room together so as to stay together and to be the most prepared if something happened again. We were all asleep when I was woken up by tapping on the window. The first thing I noticed was that all the power was out, and I took a quick glance across the street to see my neighbor's porch light still on. It was once again only us that had been affected by this power outage. I then redirected my attention to the direction of the tapping. Once I looked, the person in the window stopped tapping, and all the while, with that disgusting grin, waved to me, as if it was pleased that I'd noticed it. I grabbed the gun and showed it to the prowler, but it didn't faze her at all. She just kept right on waving and smiling. I then noticed that there was a large group, between 10 and 15 of these things, lackadaisically flailing down the street. I looked out the other window. An equally large group was coming from the other direction. I knew one thing, and that was that I didn't have enough bullets for all these people. They again converged by lining up in front of my house, but this time they all started waving. Every single one of them. It stayed this way for about 10 seconds before the one in the middle stopped waving and began moving forward. It was doing its loose walk, though this time much more slowly, up the walkway to my door. I ran to the door and told my family, now awake, to stay down and cover their eyes and ears. They obliged as I chambered around into the gun and waited. My plan was to wait until the guy got to the door, knowing I'd hear him come up the creaky wooden steps to my porch, and then swing my door open and find, at gunpoint, what he wanted with me and my family. Sure enough, I heard the creaking of the steps and him surely bouncing up each and every one of the 3 that led up to my porch. His scraping footsteps got closer and my heartbeat raised. I had never done anything like this before, and I truly felt like I wasn't prepared to put a gun in someone's face. The will to protect my family won out though, and as our doorknob rattled from whoever it was outside apparently attempting to get into my house, I swung the door open. As if it was planned, the very moment the door opened, the lights went back on. There was no one there. No one in the street, no one at our living room window, no one lined up in the front yard. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air. I assured my family that we were okay, if only for that night. It's the afternoon now, and my wife and daughter have gone to a hotel about 5 minutes away from our house. I made sure they got a room on a higher floor than the first, and politely asked hotel security to keep an extra keen eye on the grounds that night, especially in the case of any blackouts. I've decided to stay at home tonight, so I can do whatever I can to figure out what it is I'm dealing with, and what they want. I snapped out of my nerve-induced show of resilience and decided to go back to the hotel. It started during my drive. From my neighborhood, I can essentially take side streets the entire way to the back of the hotel, with the main street being on the other side of the building. As I drove down the street, each streetlight I passed went out, one by one. The darkness behind me seemed to envelop everything else, even in the moonlight. I sped up, but the darkness caught up to me. I began seeing people walking from the sidewalk towards the middle of the street in that horrible, albeit ridiculous flail. This just told me that whatever was going on was not limited to my house. These things walked in the street and waved as I drove by, dodging me as I swerved towards them. I reached the hotel, but realized I still needed to pick up the high-powered flashlights I'd resolved to get earlier. Luckily for me, there was a Walmart about 3 minutes away from the hotel. I made it there without trouble, and got in and out in about 5 minutes flat, with no interruptions from the most horrifying stalkers only nightmares could conjure. I finally made it to the hotel and went up to the 4th floor to reunite with my family. Kimmy answered the door after I knocked, whereupon I saw Anna passed out on the couch. I told my wife I had seen the things, which we decided to call Smilers, on the street on my way to the hotel. She reported back to me that nothing of concern had happened while I'd been away. This gave me a well-needed sense of peace, as I was starting to feel suffocated by the fear and paranoia. My wife and I had both fallen asleep on the couch, our daughter in the large lounge chair to our left. I was awoken by a tapping sound coming from the proper bedroom around 3 a.m. Upon opening my eyes, I knew there had been a blackout. I quickly darted up and grabbed a flashlight and headed into the room. I shined the flashlight into the bedroom, and when it was clear, I walked towards the drawn blinds. The only thing I could think of was how someone was knocking on a 4th floor window where there was no balcony. I quickly opened the blinds to an empty window. I breathed a sigh of relief, but perked back up when I heard my wife loudly whisper my name. I rushed back to the living room and saw movement in the crack between the curtains on the door to the balcony. I told my daughter to cover her eyes and approached the window. I kept the flashlight pointed forward as I inched towards the covered sliding glass door. When I reached it, I flung the curtains open and shined the light forward, directly on the 3 grinning individuals that stood before me. The light didn't seem to affect them at all. It was at this time, though, that I finally got a good look at them. They were dirty, as in their hair was ratty and knotted up. They had junk in the corners of their mouths, their clothes were tattered and torn with dirt stains all over the place. Their teeth were unkempt, for the ones that even had all their teeth. The men who sported facial hair did so without any touch of style. Beards were bushy and spotty. The main thing I noticed was their eyes, though. Through all of this filth, each and every one of their eyes shone bright in the reflection of the flashlight. I don't know how I hadn't noticed it before. Surely their eyes glistened in the dark. They were mesmerizing. I found myself just standing there looking into one of their eyes when my wife spoke my name in the same tone. I snapped out of it. I asked, loudly, what the fuck they wanted with me and my family. I was actually met with a reply this time. The woman on the left spoke very matter-of-factly when she said, "We just want you and your wife. Then we'll come for that pretty little lady." I hadn't expected a response, so I was stunned. I didn't know what to say, so I just sputtered out a pathetic, "Why?" "Because it's time. You've lived here long enough. Now it's time for you to really come home." Come home? I had no idea what she was talking about. Just as I was about to reply, each of their heads turned to their left, and they looked past me at something in our room. I looked behind me, and I saw a pair of eyes glowing in the bedroom. It had tapped on the window from the inside. I had no idea where it could have went after tapping me without seeing it. Kimmy screamed, and I ran to shut the door on this smiling intruder just as it began to take a step towards us. Just then, the power came back on. I was alerted of this by the microwave beeping, and just like that, the Smilers on the balcony were gone. I still kept the bedroom door closed anyways. I told Kimmy we needed to get out of the area. It seemed as though they would only show up during the blackouts. I didn't know if they could control the blackouts themselves, but it didn't seem so. Otherwise, why wouldn't they just finish what they came to do all in one attempt? We agreed that we weren't safe at the hotel anymore and packed our things. On our way out, the clerk who had checked us in asked what was going on. I don't remember exactly what I said, but it was something about the blackout. His response to me was, of course, "What blackout?" I didn't stop to explain. Before getting the hell out of Dodge, I thought it'd be a good idea to go past our house to see if anything had happened there in our... As we drove past, we saw the front door and every window on the first floor wide open. All the lights were off inside, but I could just barely see the glow of the display on the electronic components in the living room from the road, so it wasn't due to a blackout. I had left a few lights on before I left. I know I had. Instead of stopping to investigate, though, we just kept on driving, heading for the freeway. We've been on the road for... I don't even know how many hours now, heading east. We haven't seen anything yet, but it's also not nighttime. I have no doubt that this isn't over. About 3 hours after the previous night's events, we made it to my in-laws' cabin. It is located within the woods, and although that may sound foolish, I thought it to be a good place to go because there are 4 generators there. We stopped again at a Walmart on the way and stocked up on food, flashlights, even though I know they don't affect the Smilers, water, other random supplies, and I bought 2 large hunting knives. As someone in the comments said, knives don't run out of bullets. We didn't pass anywhere that sold ammunition, otherwise I would have stopped and gotten as much as I could carry. We got to the cabin around 9-ish last night, so already we're preparing for something to happen. We put our daughter to sleep in the family room of the cabin and stayed in there with her. I brought 2 of the generators into the room with us so they would be handy in the event of a Smiler-caused blackout. We had all the blinds closed except one, and that was simply so I could maybe see one of these things flailing about towards us before it saw us. The woods were pitch black beyond the solitary beam of light that shone through the uncovered window. The silence around us proved to be too unnerving to handle, so I put a DVD I had brought into the player to have some kind of background noise while my wife and I anxiously awaited whatever may or may not be coming for us that night. It was around 12:30 that I jolted awake. I must have dozed off while sitting there with Kimmy, who was now asleep as well. The power was still on, but the lights flickered. I quietly stood up and looked out the window. I saw nothing at first, but then in the distance, I saw two very small orbs of light just kind of appear into existence. They were stationary for a moment, then began to bounce up and down. Then, about a foot away from those, two more appeared. Then two more, and two more after that. There must have been 40 of these lights, all starting as still as can be and then proceeding to lightly bounce up and down. Then I realized they were getting bigger as they bounced. And then I noticed that they weren't just getting bigger, they were getting closer. They were the Smiler's eyes. I couldn't see their bodies in the darkness of the night, but their eyes shined like sparklers on the 4th of July as they got closer. Finally, I saw the first one's silhouette. It was big, bigger than any I'd seen before, and shortly after that, the rest of them came into view. I woke Kimmy and told her to protect Anna, and at that moment, the lights went out. I immediately revved up the generator and plugged the lights into it. I looked out the window and saw that the Smilers had stopped advancing. They then let out just an ear-shattering howl of laughter, as if someone had just told them the funniest joke they'd ever heard. In the middle of this, the generator shut off. I scrambled to start the other one, but all it did was rev, it never turned over. They had somehow blocked the use of the generators. I felt like this was it. I felt like they had us trapped and that this was the end of the line. I took my phone out to hopefully, as the comment suggested, take pictures for proof and maybe leave something to let anyone know what happened to us. I began taking pictures with the flash on my phone. I pretty much just mashed the screen over and over, taking as many as I possibly could. The scariest thing was, with each flash I could see them perfectly, and every time I took a picture they were in a different pose, each one different from the next. It was absolutely horrifying. They then let out another screeching laugh, this one startling me so bad I dropped the phone. I picked it up, and when I directed my eyes back towards the window, a female Smiler was standing there, excitedly waving at me. It was then that we heard all the glass around us shatter. All at the exact same moment. I spun around, and due to the darkness, I could barely make out figures crawling through the drawn curtains. Their bodies moved, for lack of a better word, lackadaisically. They kind of threw themselves over the partition through where the glass no longer was, then flailed their limbs over. Luckily, it took quite some time for them to get through. I looked back at the window I was initially in front of, and for the first time, I saw a different expression on the Smiler's face. She had a look of pure, just surprise, raised eyebrows with a hand over her mouth. It looked sarcastic, though. I grabbed the gun and fired it directly into the surprised-looking one's face. I fired close enough to the window that it completely shattered, and when the figurative dust settled, there was no Smiler there anymore. A wave of confidence rushed over me, although I was in shock. I'd never killed anything in my life before. I snapped back to reality when I heard a voice softly say my name. I turned around and there was the woman Smiler directly in front of me, only she wasn't smiling. She looked furious. There was pain in her eyes, rage. She struck me with an open backhand which had way too much power for the size of woman she was, and it sent me tumbling back. I reached up and grabbed the knife off of the table I landed next to and unsheathed it. The woman let out a lone laugh while the rest of the Smilers advanced from the other parts of the house from which they crawled into towards my family and I. I got up, my entire being composed of nearly all fear, and I decided to go for broke. I lunged at the woman and swung my arm in a stabbing motion. As soon as the knife would have connected, she vanished, along with the rest of the Smilers. And at the same moment the lights turned on and, inexplicably, all the generators began running, including the ones outside. I stumbled forward, nearly falling on my face, dropping the knife to the floor. I immediately got my grounding and rushed over to my family's aid. Though stricken to their core with terror, they were unharmed. My wife insisted we immediately leave and get to somewhere more populated. We got in the car and began driving. I asked Kimmy to look in my phone at the pictures I took, as I told her I wanted to get pictures of them for proof, and so I could show the people in NoSleep to get their opinion on what it was we were dealing with. As frustrating as this is going to sound, each and every picture I took last night was black. Not pure black like the camera wasn't working, but black like I was shining it into nothing and wasn't using the flash. There's no other way I can think to explain it. I let out a loud "fuck," much to the grimace of my wife. I knew that when they laughed after I took the pictures, it was because they knew they weren't going to turn out. Anna was in tears still, and I don't blame her. I don't know what to think about the night's events. Had I somehow stopped them from hurting us by swinging the knife? No answers had really been given. I talked to Kimmy and we decided it might be a good idea to take the advice of several commenters and split up. We each acknowledged that it was bad horror movie etiquette, but we were at a loss for any other options. We bought a used car decent enough to get my wife and daughter to her parents' house today, while I'll be staying at a hotel nearby in case something does in fact happen to them. I'll be close. I have also contacted a paranormal researcher who will be meeting me at my hotel, and has agreed to stay with me for the night to hopefully witness what has been going on. In addition to this, because I stressed the urgency of everything going on, he said he would make my case priority 1 and do some quick research into my family as well as my house before meeting with me. Last night, a paranormal researcher came to stay with me at the hotel I was at, and much to my surprise, he brought a priest with him. I chose to get a first-floor room, since I knew that being on a different floor didn't hinder the Smilers from getting to me. I kept in constant contact with my wife, who, as you'll soon find out, didn't stay at her parents' house for the night like we'd planned. The researcher, whose name is Paul, gave me an overview of what I was dealing with, and I have to say, some of you guys in the comments nailed it. Since it was still daylight, he felt as if we would be okay discussing the situation at the hotel since we were already there, and then we moved back to our house. One commenter said that the house was a threshold, and that commenter was right. The priest and Paul agreed that if we were going to get to the bottom of this, we should start at the only place these things haven't evidently been able to enter. The information he relayed to me was to the best of his knowledge of the paranormal. What we were dealing with was a sort of skinwalker ghost hybrid. They inhabitate recently buried bodies, which explains their overall dirty look. As far as what they want with my family and I, it's still up in the air. The priest, Father John, asked if anyone in either of our families had recently passed, and the answer was no. I had my wife on speakerphone all while we spoke about this. The only conclusion we could come up with was that the Smilers had us mistaken with another family. It's kind of a cop-out if you ask me, but at least it was something. We made the hour-long trip back to our house, and when we got there, the doors were shut and all the blinds were drawn, which was obviously different since the last time I'd driven by the house. It was on the brink of dusk, so we hurried into the house and made sure the power was on before we ventured past the foyer. The first thing Father John and Paul did was walk around and unplug everything that could be used as a source of light. This pretty much included any and everything that was plugged in. Next, Father John salted all the entryways, Again, I know. I felt stupid for not doing this before at the cabin. I just think it was all the commotion. I should be allowed a slip-up or two. I've never dealt with this kind of thing before, alright? While Father John salted, Paul, myself, and Kimmy put about 150 candles throughout the house. My daughter sat on the couch watching a DVD on a portable DVD player. She knew it would have to be shut off before it got dark. We were taking the advice of a commenter that the Smilers feed off of electricity. We got as prepared as we could, given the circumstances. Father John armed each of us with holy relics and kept a small container of holy water on each platform that surrounded us in the living room in which we put ourselves. Many people commented to go to places with large populations, and while this is a good idea, it wouldn't have solved anything. If I wouldn't have gotten in contact with Paul, I have no doubt that finding a heavily populated and lit area is what we would have done last night. But it wouldn't be a permanent solution. I want to stop this, not just delay it. That said, I do have to thank each and every commenter, for the most part, for your information, your hypotheses, your tips and tricks. You have all given me invaluable information, and I truly believe my family and I would not have made it this far without all of your help. I chose the right route posting this to NoSleep, I have no doubt about it. Anyways, the sun set. Night had blanketed over our neighborhood, and I don't know if it was just me and my nerves, but it seemed darker than ever. My daughter had put away the portable DVD player, and we turned off all of our phones except for Father John's, as we figured keeping one line of communication open would probably be a good idea. We basically all just huddled in the middle of the living room while my daughter slept on the couch, our house illuminated dimly by the throws of candles we had lit. It was about 1 a.m. when it started this time around. Paul happened to be looking out the window when the streetlights on either side about 3 houses down suddenly went out. He got my attention, and the rest of us rushed over. The next set of lights went out. It was between this set going out and the next one that we finally saw them, lumbering along in the Bernie-esque fashion they do, eyes glistening in the moonlight. I immediately saw the fear in Paul's eyes. He voiced his concern. I know I said what they were, but I've never actually seen one before. I thought, fucking great, a lot of help you'll be now. Perhaps selfishly, but it kinda irritated me that he was about as skilled at these things as I was. However, at least he could see them. I sent my wife over to protect Anna. Through all of this, their safety was my only concern, whether it seems like it or not. As they approached, I found myself once again frozen while my eyes locked onto a set of theirs. I was shaken by Father John, and we went to the middle of the room and anxiously waited for them to reach the house. Sadly, there wasn't much we could do on the offensive side of things. While they slowly flailed their way towards us, I confirmed that both Paul and Father John had seen them, then asked why the cop couldn't. They concluded that it must be the house itself that makes people besides myself and my family capable of seeing them. Another semi-answer. I asked Paul if he had gotten any information on the house, and he said he had only had time to do a quick Google search on the property and was unable to delve further into its history and past occupants. I felt like that was where the true answer was going to lie. They eventually made it to the yard, and that's when they stopped walking and began waving, smiling all the while. All but one. It was the female that had let out the laughter the night before. She just stood there, back arched backwards, arms hanging behind her. She was expressionless. She hobbled her way up to the front door and knocked. Plain as day, as if she was a UPS driver, just knocked on the door. None of us moved. Then she pounded on the door, and kept pounding, and didn't stop until my wife screamed, "What?" We were met with silence, until the woman's smiler broke it. "It's time for you to go." Father John responded, "This is not your home. This family owes you nothing. Be gone." The smiler let out the same shrill laughter I'd heard the night before. It was horrifying, and a sound I'll never be able to forget. The other Smilers crept up to the windows, all but one of which was covered by curtains. They started banging on the windows, but not breaking them. Now that I think about it, even their walk was less exaggerated than it normally, quote-unquote, normally was. I believe whoever said it was correct. They do in fact feed off of electricity. They weakly banged on the windows, while their female leader gave us a warning. You cannot keep him out of where he belongs forever. Father John asked who, and then it was over. The Smilers were gone, and the streetlights came back on. We all breathed a deep sigh of relief, but yet again I was met with more questions than answers. Why was it time for us to go? Who was I keeping out of where he belonged? I felt the answers lied in the history of the house. Now, I love my wife dearly. She and my daughter are everything. But even with the warnings I had stressed to her, she made a stupid-ass decision. For whatever reason, while we were all collecting ourselves, she walked over and opened the front door, presumably to check the porch and verify that the female stalker was gone. Don't ask me why. I'll never know what compelled her to do something so fucking ridiculous. As soon as she turned the knob, Father John yelled, "No!" But it was too late. The door flew open and pinned itself against the wall behind it. At the same time, the streetlights went out again. There stood the female Smiler, only she wasn't smiling. She looked rabid. She was breathing heavily, her eyes were popping out of her head, and her fists were clenched as she, for the first time I'd ever seen a Smiler do, leaned forward. She looked down at the archway of salt. "Move the salt, and we will show you mercy," she said. "Mercy for what? What have they done?" pleaded Father John as he held up a rosary. He moved closer, and his presence did seem to have an effect on the Smiler, who returned to her normal position, back arched backwards, arms hanging. "We have been nice enough. You have been the one to take issue," she said as she flung her arm up and pointed her crusty finger at me. All I could think was, no shit I took issue. Dirty ghost, zombie, demon, limp walker assholes have been trying to take my family to do God knows what with. Father John retorted, "You will not haunt this family into submission." She stood there in silence for a moment before opening her large mouth to reply. But as she began to speak her first words, every candle in the house blew out, and she disappeared. Right before our eyes, like someone had flipped a switch, the streetlights came back on yet again, and the light poured in through the door in the one uncovered window. None of us could move. We all stayed where we were for what felt like an eternity. The sound of my daughter crying broke the silence, and Kimmy went over to comfort her. Myself, Father John, and Phil reconvened in the middle of the living room, and it was obvious. We needed to know about this house in order to figure out what to do about this problem. I'm typing this about an hour after the events I've just described. As soon as the sun is up, Paul and Father John are going to go out and do their research. My family and I are going to stay in our home, guarded by the salt, which seemed to do the trick, and we're going to make sure to keep all electricity use to a minimum, as we don't really know if the Smilers potentially charge during the day and then reveal themselves at night. I will relay the information I get to you tomorrow, as well as any events that may or may not occur tonight. This has been a terrible few days, but for the first time throughout all of this, I feel like we may be on the path to the end. Well, my family and I spent the day at home, and it was ultimately an extremely boring day. Father John and Paul were out doing their research while we essentially just sat in silence all day. We had been advised to use as little electronics as possible, so that took out any kind of entertainment we had, save for board games, which, to be honest, we've become far too accustomed to technology to have that entertain us for any real length of time. Father John and Paul got back to our house at around 3 in the afternoon, and they came with information. Our house was built in 1955, and no, the land was not once a cemetery or ancient Indian burial ground or anything. The problem lies in a past resident. When we got the house, we knew it hadn't been lived in quite some time, nearly a decade. This was attributed by the realtor to the constant blackouts in the area. Apparently, houses in that neighborhood stayed vacant for quite some time before someone who decided they could live with the blackouts came across them. The last occupant of the house before us was a man named Lee Rickle, and his family, which consisted of his wife and daughter. Lee and his wife Georgia were elderly, and their daughter, Carrie Ann, stayed with them to take care of them in their old age. With this information, Father John and Paul were able to dig into the occupants. Lee suffered from Hodgkin's lymphoma, but was an active member in the church community. When there was an issue with his Social Security, other members of the church banded together and took over his mortgage for him for nearly a year. Lee was a very well-liked man, apparently, but from what they read to me, it seemed as if he had a bit of a dark side. His wife and daughter were admitted to the hospital several times throughout their lives for what looked to be domestic abuse-related injuries. On the outside, though, all seemed well, and his wife was a loyal one, and his daughter a caring one. It seemed as though, even though they had their problems, they were still a tight-knit family. Lee eventually died from his disease in the house in 1992. It wasn't revealed in which room it happened or anything, but at least it was something. Georgia and Carrie Ann spent the next year together in the house, and apparently they got heavily involved in the practices of seances and speaking with the dead in an attempt to locate Lee. This information was found due to a small fire that had happened in the kitchen, which was the result of candles being used during one of the seances. The realtor had informed us of the fire, but didn't reveal to us the cause, just that it had been caused by candles. We thought nothing of it. It had been fixed, so we didn't give it a second thought. In late 1993, Georgia passed away from natural causes in the city hospital. The house was inhabited solely by Carrie Ann for the next 6 months, and continued to be the site of many communications with the dead. For unknown reasons, Carrie Ann moved away, and the house sat vacant until we bought it in late 2013. Carrie Ann committed suicide last week, and was buried in the cemetery in a plot next to her parents. Father John and Paul then gave their opinions on what they felt the issue was. They are under the impression that with the death of Carrie Ann, the Rickle family is now back together, and they want their house back. We thought back to when I was spoken to for the first time with the phrase, "You've been here long enough, it's time to come home," and came to the conclusion that those were two separate statements, as in, you and your family have been here long enough, it's time for us to come home. I know this is a long shot, but it would fit the scenario if this was in fact the case. As far as them suddenly getting violent, it's thought that it was due to my apprehension to let them in. They had smiled and waved, in a gesture of friendliness, and I had taken it the wrong way. When we left the house, they knew we would eventually come back, so they showed up at the hotel, and then the cabin, to continue to persuade us to leave the house for good. When I shot the smiler through the window, it apparently angered them, so they broke all the windows and came in and were prepared to attack. Our guess is that due to the limited energy being used at the cabin, they couldn't defend against the knife attack, so they disappeared when I attempted to stab the woman smiler. As for what was said last night, the whole, "you can't keep him out of where he belongs forever," is the angry side of Lee Rickle coming out, demanding he get his home back. Our guess is that the large number of people are spirits that Lee has befriended in the afterlife to help in the effort to get his home back. Mind you, this is all conjecture. All evidence of what we're assuming this to be is circumstantial at best. For all we know, we could be totally off. I think that might be the scariest part. What we do know for sure, though, is that the salt worked. It fended them off last night. Also, the smiler seemed to respond to Father John's rosary, so that was a good line of defense too. The problem is, we can't control the power outside the house, which, if they are in fact energized by the electricity, which then causes the blackouts, we can't defend ourselves in that way. Also, we have no idea why the Smilers approached my wife and daughter first. Our only thoughts on that are that some of the Smilers aren't necessarily on the same mission as the rest. Some of them may have ulterior, more sinister motives. I have to say, it's extremely frustrating not knowing what exactly it is we're dealing with, and working only off of semi-educated hypotheses. But alas, it was all we had. We reinforced the salt barriers and relit all the candles throughout the house in preparation for whatever the night brought. We then just waited, each taking turns sleeping while the others kept an eye out. Nothing happened until about 3:30 a.m. Father John woke me up and told me he had heard something upstairs. We looked out the window, and from what we could see, all the power was on in the street. Myself, Paul, and Father John made our way upstairs, each armed with a holy relic. We searched the upstairs but found nothing. As we were heading back downstairs, the door to the attic, the kind that swings down and drops a ladder, did just that, sending the ladder down with a loud crash. We nearly jumped out of our skin as we turned around. An angry-looking Smiler, oxymoron I know, bobbed his way down the attic stairs. Father John started saying a prayer, while Paul and I held up our rosaries. This Smiler moved with caution when he saw the holy relics. It was as if he knew they would hurt him, so he wasn't so quick to advance on us. Instead, he almost tiptoed towards us, backing us down the stairs. I finally just spit out, "What do you want?" and it just started whispering incoherently. Just then, 2 more Smilers came tumbling down the attic steps like they had fallen. They got to their feet and moved ahead quickly behind their angry friend. Suddenly, the Smiler behind the one that was slowly approaching us pushed the one closest to us directly into us. It hit Father John's cross and let out a shriek, and before it disappeared into thin air, it knocked us backwards down the stairs, and we all tumbled on top of one another as we fell, step after step. The 2 remaining Smilers threw themselves down the stairs, tumbling just like we had, but voluntarily. They landed at our feet and got back up as if nothing had happened. They ignored us as we sat at the bottom of the stairs writhing in pain, too shaken up to even notice what was happening. Once in the line of sight of my wife, she screamed. One Smiler made a beeline for the front door, and the other went for a side window in the room opposite the living room. They both stopped before the salt, inhaled deeply, and blew the salt away, effectively opening the barriers between us and the rest of them. It was then that I noticed every light in the neighborhood was out. Every streetlight was dark, and every other house for as far as we could see were completely pitch black. What seemed to be an entire night sky of stars worth of bouncing, glowing eyes was making its way towards our house from every direction. Father John quickly got up and ran to the Smiler at the front door, pressing the relic against it, causing it to dissipate. I followed suit and lunged at the one by the window, doing the same thing, successfully. Father John put his back to the door, but was sent flying forward when that door was broken off of its hinges. The woman Smiler I had come to know and hate so much stood there before me, actually smiling. I don't know what I hated more, the smile or the angry face. Paul asked what the Smiler wanted, and she simply replied, "Uninterrupted access to our home." "Are you Carrie Ann Rickle?" Father John inquired. "No, I am Georgia Rickle," the Smiler retorted. "This is no longer your home. Be gone," demanded our brave priest. Georgia let out that shrieking laughter that could have shattered all the windows. Suddenly, Paul lunged forward from behind me in an attempt to hit Georgia with his rosary. She simply sidestepped, which resulted in Paul falling forward onto his face, into the outside. In an instant, he was swarmed by Smilers, whose flailing limbs and falling bodies quickly made it unable to even see Paul. All we could hear was his screams. "We came in peace," said Georgia, "but you've left us no choice. The only way you get to reside here any longer is as one of us, and that is only if my husband allows you to. He is simply tired of your selfishness in this matter and demands you be dealt with in the most mortal of ways. If you had just given us our home back in the first place, you could have gone on about your life." I didn't know what to say. I could only live here still if I was dead and had my soul moved into someone else's body, and regardless I was going to die? This was so far beyond any realm of knowledge I possessed. She continued, "We will be back tomorrow evening, and it will be your last chance to accept your fate peacefully. Otherwise, you will be responsible for whatever pain my husband decides to impose on you and your family." And with that, she was gone. All the candles in our house blew out, and the lights in the neighborhood went back on. Had she basically told me that tomorrow night we were gonna die one way or the other? Father John was honest with me, and told me that an exorcism probably wouldn't do anything, because they weren't necessarily haunting anything, they just had a specific goal in mind. They would be doing this to whoever was in the house, and would be doing it to whatever house they wanted. Father John did say that he assumed they had done this sort of thing before, but probably hadn't been met with such resistance. Paul was gone. He had vanished with the rest of the Smilers. That is something that's going to weigh heavily on my conscience for a long time. Then I had an idea. Since I was essentially out of options and was more than likely going to die the following night anyways, I decided it was time to be a little more proactive for once. Father John insisted against it. My wife hated the idea, and my daughter was terrified, but I was just thinking, fuck them. I'll do what I have to keep my family safe. At that point, I was on my way home with 5 gallons of gasoline. I was at my wit's end. This entire situation had been literally driving me crazy, and I couldn't fight those things. I could hardly defend myself against them. I'd been essentially condemned by the de facto matriarch of what I thought was mine and my family's home. I didn't know what else to do. Father John blessed our house numerous times throughout the day and prayed with my family and I as we mourned the loss of Paul, who gave his life trying to protect us. I will never, ever forget the sight of the swarm enveloping Paul. I'm still not sure what exactly they did to him, whether they ate him or tore him apart or what, but whatever it was obviously painful. For as much as I'll never be able to forget that visual aspect of the attack, it's the auditory terror of his pain screams that will truly haunt me until the end of my days. We took the advice of a few commenters this time. For one, we disconnected the main power source to the house, and then we salted all the windows and doors again, this time not forgetting the window in the attic, or any of them in the basement. We had a plan for what we were going to do, and it required some finesse. Father John got a collection of holy relics and set them up around the house in various places, and set jars of salt up on predetermined posts. We then armed ourselves with multiple toilet paper roll-sized tubes of salt which we holstered in our pockets. My wife remained practically silent throughout everything. I could tell this was taking a severe emotional toll on her. All I wanted, my only goal in all of this, was to protect her and our daughter. The gas cans were sitting idly by in our kitchen. I still wasn't exactly sure what the plan was with those. I mean, I had an idea, but like I said, it was going to take some grace to pull off what we wanted to do. We waited in the dark, lighting only a few solitary candles in the living room in which we twiddled our thumbs, quite possibly waiting to meet our demise. The Smilers wasted no time this time around. The entire street went black, including all streetlights and houses. It seemed darker than usual, though. Even though the moon was out, it was as though the darkness was overtaking any light. One by one, sets of glowing eyes appeared down the street in both directions. As usual, We kept all the curtains closed except for one set, which was for sight purposes. We had to see when they were coming. The glowing eyes grew brighter as the Smilers flailed towards us, until their silhouettes appeared in a visage I wish I had never laid eyes on. There must have been 50 to 60 Smilers in the street, only not a single one of them was smiling. Each one sported a foul grimace, one that said they were now beyond the apparent pleasantries they had initially approached us with. How they thought their initial appearance was in any way welcoming is, it's beyond me. Coming from the left, I saw one Smiler in particular being followed in a way by the others. In my infinite wisdom on the beings I was dealing with, I took this to mean that this Smiler was the Lady Rickle. Then all of a sudden, behind the group that was paraded around her was, as far as I could tell from a distance, a male Smiler, bigger than I'd ever seen before, who, while still somewhat lazily flailing about as he moved, seemed to have a much smoother and more connected way of movement about him. While the Smilers I had seen up to this point had such an exaggerated way of getting to where they needed to go, as if they were being controlled by a marionette, this bigger fellow moved about as though he were a stumbling drunk. I know those don't sound too different, but trust me, there's a big difference between them. I immediately made the connection and alerted Father John that I was relatively sure that Lee Rickle himself was joining the show. We got ourselves armed with holy relics and approached the spot where my front door was propped up against the door frame, having been broken off its hinges the night before. It felt like an eternity as they made their way down the street. Once they were finally nearing our property, Georgia let out a screeching, howling laughter. As they continued approaching, they spoke. "I must say, I'm quite surprised to see you here, though we would have found you anywhere." Before I could even process what was being said, Father John spoke up. "We wish to come to an agreement," he hollered at the top of his lungs. Georgia retorted by mimicking her first laugh, and was joined by a new, much deeper laugh. "My husband wants to meet the man who denied his extended hand," Georgia announced. I still couldn't wrap my mind around the fact that she thought we would have seen them for the first time and been like, "Oh, what's up?" all casually. "I didn't mean to disrespect anyone. I didn't know what you wanted. All I was trying to do is protect my family. We will happily leave," I yelled, hoping to come to some kind of understanding. I was met with no reply. I stood there, breathing heavily, anxiously awaiting a response. After about 30 seconds of silence, I took a peek through a crack between the propped-up door and the frame. I jumped back when I was met with a stare from both Georgia and Lee Rickle. There was something about the Smiler's eyes that always absolutely captivated me the moment I first looked into them. I broke my gaze and stepped back, moving the door away from the frame, confronting the enemy once and for all. "We will leave, please," I pleaded. "I find your resilience inspiring. I can't simply end your existence. I would require you to become a member of my group. Move the salt." "This family has done nothing to you," Father John explained. "They were simply frightened by your abrupt appearance and—" He was cut off by a low-pitched, yet very loud growl by Lee Rickle. I'm assuming this was because he didn't particularly care for a holy man to be speaking to him. "I have made my decision. Now remove this salt. There is nowhere for you to go that I will not send my subordinates to find you." There was a tense silence for what seemed like another eternity. I looked over at my cowering wife and daughter in the living room as tears filled my eyes. This was it. "May I have a private moment with my wife and child?" I politely asked. "Remove the salt and put down the crosses you've armed yourselves with. Then you may do as you wish." I reluctantly slid my foot over the salt, brushing it away in every direction. Each of the four of us slid our holy relics across the floor, away from the Rickles. Lee, Georgia, and a third Smiler that hadn't yet spoken and I hadn't yet seen hobbled in. I presumed this to be Carrie Ann. "Home sweet home," said Lee in a repulsively smug tone. "You will take your moment here, in front of us, and then we will commence the evening." the Rickles took a look around at their new old house, while being sure not to get too far away from us. "Father, pray with us," I all but demanded. The four of us huddled mere feet away from our soon-to-be killers, I guess you could say. I didn't know what they were going to do to us exactly, but I knew it wasn't going to go or end well. I only hoped it would be fast. I couldn't bear thinking my sweet daughter could potentially be moments away from suffering the same ambiguous fate as Paul. I whispered to everyone, "I just saw Brian go past the back door. As soon as he makes it to the front, we go." Father John whispered a prayer as I kept my eyes focused on the side window of the house, waiting to see a shadow rush past. It seemed like it took forever, but it happened. I waited about another 2 seconds before I whispered, "Go!" We began what felt like a slow-motion dash through the hallway and into the kitchen. Behind us, I heard a roar from who I assumed was Lee. None of us hesitated. We reached the kitchen, which contained the back door. I had left the caps loose on the gas containers, and as quick as I could, I tipped all 5 over, flooding the kitchen and the hallway with the pungent substance. Father John flung the back door open, and we tumbled outside. The Rickles were quickly behind us, but stopped at the door line and stumbled back into the kitchen. "What have you done?" Lee demanded to know. I didn't even think to answer him before I lit a book of matches on fire and tossed it into the kitchen, setting our home ablaze. We ran around to the front yard, avoiding smilers that seemed to just be standing there, mesmerized by something we couldn't see. Father John, of course, saw nothing, as he was no longer in the house. We reached the front yard to meet Brian, Paul's brother. A paranormal enthusiast, but not in the profession, he had agreed to help us. As the fire raged through the house, a small explosion lit up the sky towards the back of the house. While I was talking to the Rickles, my wife had gone back and started the stove. It wasn't enough to cause an instant detonation like we'd hoped, but it had certainly helped spread the fire quicker than it would have naturally. Brian's part in our plan was integral. While I talked to the Rickles in the house and took a quote-unquote moment with my family and Father John, Brian ran around the house, pouring out 2 gallons worth of blessed salt water Father John had provided him with earlier in the day. That's what trapped the Rickles in the house. As I heard roars and ear-shattering screams from within the house, the rest of the Smilers just stood there, and before we could even blink, all but maybe 3 or 4 of them were just gone. The remaining Smilers then simply turned around and flailed about in different directions, all away from us. We're not sure who these lucky survivors, I guess you could call them. We don't know who they were or why they didn't disappear with the rest, but my guess is that they were the ones that were not directly connected to the Rickles and their mission. Again, strictly conjecture. I don't know if I'll ever know for sure. Without waiting to see the rest of the house go down in flames, but not before the roars and screams from within subsided, we all got in our cars and drove away. We're now in a town about 80 miles from our burning house. We received a call alerting us that our house was on fire. I explained that we were currently on vacation and that this was a surprise to us. I had only hoped that none of my neighbors had seen us drive away, but I'm sure I'm not that lucky. I have an idea of what I'm going to tell the police regarding why there was an obviously gasoline-fueled fire that occurred at my home, but that'll be another story for another day. On this day, we won.